Welcome to the Soccer Tavern, where we're discussing the history, culture, and philosophy of the beautiful game. My name is Dave, and in this video, we're talking about the history of Newcastle United Football Club. Pull up a seat, and let's start the discussion. Newcastle United is located in the central part of the city of Newcastle upon Tyne. Newcastle upon Tyne is located in the far northeastern part of England in the United Kingdom. The club currently play in the Premier League, and its home ground is called St. James's Park, which holds a little more than 52,000 people. Newcastle have been at St. James's Park since 1892, but soccer has been played on the land where St. James's Park is located since 1880. Newcastle in its current iteration was founded in 1892, but the club has ties that go back to the 1880s. In the early 1880s, two of a handful of soccer clubs playing in the Newcastle area were named Newcastle East End and Newcastle West End respectively. By 1884, both clubs had become the strongest sides in the area. By the 1891-92 season, West End were struggling financially. In May of 1892, East End took over the lease for West End Stadium, which was St. James's Park, and some of West End's assets, including players, which effectively meant that the two clubs merged. East End kept their name for a few months, but on December 9, 1892, at a meeting of the club's directors in the Bath Lane Hall, the club voted to change the name to Newcastle United in a bid to attract support from the whole city. The legal name of the club didn't formally change until 1895, but 1892 is seen as the club's founding date. The club has three nicknames: United, the Magpies, and Toon. The United nickname clearly comes from the club's official name. The Magpies nickname comes from the club's colors. Newcastle have played in black and white striped shirts since 1894. Magpies are small black and white colored birds that are very common in the UK. Newcastle playing in kits that resembled these birds led to the nickname of Magpies. Finally, the Toon nickname comes from the local pronunciation of the word town, as people in Newcastle, also called Geordies, speak their own dialect. Even though Newcastle United doesn't have the word town in its club name, this different pronunciation of the word has become so synonymous with the city of Newcastle that it's been extended to apply to the city's only prominent soccer club, Newcastle United. Most interestingly, research has shown that the Geordie pronunciation of the word town, so Toon, is actually the original pronunciation of the word. The Toon pronunciation dates back to 500 AD, before the Great Vowel Shift, which apparently is a real thing that happened in the middle of the last millennium, changed the pronunciation of lots of words, including the pronunciation of town. The club's current crest, which has been used since 1988, takes many of its elements from the coat of arms for the city of Newcastle upon Tyne. The castle at the top of the crest is derived from a new castle that was built in 1080 AD by Robert Courthose. That's also where the name of the city comes from. Coming out of the top of the castle is a lion that guards the castle and holds a flagstaff with a modified version of the St. George's pennon flying. The mythical seahorses on either side of the crest are a reference to Newcastle being a seaport town. The shield comes directly from the coat of arms, and the black and white stripes on the shield come from Newcastle United's iconic colors. Lastly, the scroll with Newcastle United at the bottom is obviously the name of the club. I wanted to talk about 5 events in this section. First up, on May 7th, 1955, Newcastle United beat Manchester City 3-1 in the FA Cup final. The club had also won the 1951 and 1952 FA Cups, so this third FA Cup in 5 years earned the club the nickname of the Cup Kings at that time. The next event I'd like to mention happened about 15 years later. Newcastle finished 10th in the first division in the 67-68 season, but qualified for the next season's Inter-Cities Fairs Cup through a weird quirk in the rules. The Inter-Cities Fairs Cup was the predecessor to the UEFA Cup, now known as the Europa League. It was the club's first time competing in Europe, and they were 1,000 to 1 odds to win the tournament. Improbably, they made the 1969 Inter-Cities Fairs Cup final, where they played Újpest Dózsa from Hungary. Újpest were overwhelming favorites in the final as well, but Newcastle won both legs to seal a 6-2 aggregate victory. They raised their first and so far only European trophy on June 11th, 1969. The third event I want to discuss came at the end of the 1991-92 season. Newcastle was in danger of being relegated to the third division for the first time in the club's history. The club was in a bit of financial trouble at that time too, so it's not clear if the club could have survived relegation to the third tier. On May 2nd, 1992, the club played Leicester City in their final match. Newcastle was out of the relegation zone, but could still be caught by 3 other clubs behind them in the table, so they needed to win their match. After going 1-0 up, the club surrendered an 89th minute equalizing goal to put the fate of the club out of its own hands. Only 1 minute later, though, Newcastle forced an own goal from Leicester, which sent the team and traveling fans into delirium as it meant the club was safe. I also wanted to quickly mention 2 other events here. On April 3rd, 1996, Newcastle lost heartbreakingly to Liverpool 4-3 in one of the greatest matches in Premier League history. Newcastle were chasing the Premier League title that season, and this heartbreaking result more or less sealed their fate as not winning the title that year. And the final event I want to discuss happened on February 5th, 2011. Newcastle trailed Arsenal 4-0 after only 26 minutes into the match, but the Toons scored 4 goals in the final 21 minutes of the match to pull off one of the greatest comebacks in Premier League history. People from Newcastle are known as Geordies, dating back to the city's support of King George during a rebellion in the 1740s. With Newcastle United being pretty much the only major club in town, Newcastle fans are referred to as Geordies. Geordies have their own dialect and a strong accent that can sometimes be difficult for people to understand. I can attest to this as my high school soccer coach was from Newcastle and was often difficult to understand. Another nickname for supporters is the Toon Army, which is a reference to the club's nickname of Toon. I'd like to discuss 3 players in this section. Paul Gascoigne, nicknamed Gaza, joined Newcastle as a youth player at 16 years old and signed for the first team in 1985. He won the Young Player of the Year award from the Premier League in 1988 and joined Tottenham for a then British transfer record fee that year. He was an incredibly talented player who wore his heart on his sleeve every time he played. His life off the field was tumultuous, but he was incredibly talented on the pitch. Even though his time with Newcastle was brief, he's still regarded as one of the most talented players in the club's history. Peter Beardsley was nicknamed Pedro and played attacking midfield for Newcastle. He scored 119 goals in 2 different spells with the club and had tons of assists as well. Alan Shearer is the greatest striker in Premier League history, scoring a record 260 goals in the league. He's originally from Newcastle but didn't join the club until 1996, 8 years into his professional career. Although he didn't win a trophy with Newcastle, he scored a club record 206 goals in 405 appearances. He was regarded as one of the best strikers in the world during his playing career. I want to highlight 4 managers in this section. Stan Seymour managed Newcastle in 3 separate stints and is one of the most influential people in the club's history. Seymour played, managed, and was in the boardroom for the club. He actually played on the last Newcastle United team that won the First Division title and was the first person in English soccer history to win the FA Cup as a player and as a manager. Seymour led the club to 2 FA Cups as a manager and was instrumental in the boardroom for helping the club win a 3rd FA Cup in the 1950s. Next, Joe Harvey was similar to Stan Seymour as he was a former player that led the club to trophies. He took over in 1962 and led the club until 1975. Harvey managed the club to their only European title and has the most wins as a manager in club history. Kevin Keegan took over as manager for the 1991-1992 season that we already talked about and saved the club from relegation. Keegan led the club to promotion to the Premier League, and the club's exciting attacking style of play earned them the nickname of the Entertainers. Keegan nearly won the Premier League in 1995-1996, and he is regarded as one of the best managers in club history. He left the club in January of 1997, but returned for a short second stint with the club in 2008. That only lasted about half a year, but King Kev still has a fond place in Newcastle fans' hearts. And finally, Sir Bobby Robson was born and raised in the Newcastle area. He went on to a legendary playing and managing career all over Europe. Robson won domestic league titles and cups as well as European titles, in addition to managing the English national team at 2 World Cups. Robson managed Newcastle at the end of his career, managing from 1999 until 2004. Though the club didn't win any trophies during his tenure, they did qualify for the Champions League a handful of times, and it was the club's most successful period since Kevin Keegan left in the mid-1990s. Newcastle United's biggest rival is Sunderland A.F.C. The two cities are only 12 miles apart and have been in conflict for over 300 years, well before the modern version of soccer was created. The conflict actually starts when the trading of coal was awarded to Newcastle traders only by the king, which left Sunderland traders in a terrible spot. The two cities have been at odds ever since this. The soccer clubs first played each other in 1888 and have played each other over 150 times. When the two clubs meet, the matches are called the Tyne and Wear Derby. Matches are really intense affairs with hooliganism and violence by fans common, though modern technologies have helped quell this a bit. Newcastle's second biggest rival is Middlesbrough Football Club. The rivalry is nowhere near as intense as the Sunderland rivalry, though. The cities of Newcastle and Middlesbrough are 42 miles apart, so although they are regional rivals, fans aren't encountering each other on a daily basis quite as much as the Sunderland rivalry. The clubs have met in meaningful matches over the years, but the rivalry doesn't seem to be much more than simply not liking your neighbors. Newcastle also tends to dominate media coverage in the area, which can bother some Borough fans and help fuel this rivalry. The stats and records we're about to discuss are as of March 2018, which is when we are recording this video. United have spent 86 seasons in the top flight in their history. The club has 11 major trophies, including 6 FA Cups, 4 First Division titles, and 1 Inter-Cities Fairs Cup, which again was the predecessor to the UEFA Cup or Europa League. The club's record first-team appearance holder is Jimmy Lawrence, with 496 appearances. The club's record goal scorer is Alan Shearer with 206 goals. The Magpies' record transfer purchase was Michael Owen from Real Madrid in Spain on August 24, 2006 for about £16 million, and the club's record transfer sale was Andy Carroll to Liverpool FC in January of 2011 for about £35 million. And one last interesting fact about the club, Newcastle United jointly hold the record for the biggest scoreline in English Football League history. The club beat Newport County 13-0 on October 15, 1946 in the second division to set that record. So, there you have it, a bit of history on Newcastle United Football Club. Let's continue this discussion in the comment section below the video. Thanks for stopping by the Soccer Tavern. Hope to see you again soon. Cheers!